Okay, well I suppose everyone can hear me better now with this. Even more soft-spoken if I want to be, I suppose. So as Neil said, this was my second season on the Alvar. And what that really means is I have lived by myself off-grid with no running water or electricity since April on the grassland on Turnbull Ranch. So, but it has been great. That's the way I would prefer to live. And before coming to this, I showered in the lake. So, that was great. Maybe I shouldn't say that. I will also preface this presentation with, I have been, like I just said, alone for the last about 5 months. So if I might just not know how to speak anymore partway through, and someone just, get my attention and tell me to speak as a human again instead of a bird. Okay, see, I've already started that way. Okay, so I am the recovery biologist for the Eastern Loggerhead Shrike Recovery Program at Wildlife Preservation Canada. WPC is headquartered in Guelph, and but we have field locations all over Canada, as far west as Vancouver, but the majority of our work is done in Ontario. I am so excited to be talking to you guys today, just because we are so close to the Carden Alvar, where all of my work is based. So last year I was the Carden biologist, which means I did all of the field work and captive release work in Carden, and then I was boosted up to be recovery biologist, which means that I also run all of our volunteer programs and do a lot of research over the winter, as well as help coordinate the rest of our team in Napanee. So the Carden Alvar, as all of you know, is a crucial area for Ontario's loggerhead shrike population, and it's such a beautiful location to get to live and work in. And just, I guess, a little bit about myself before telling you all about my shrike work is that I've been doing avian field research since 2015 with all sorts of different universities from coast to coast across Canada, from New Brunswick out to BC, in the prairies in the middle as well. But I have never worked with a species that has so few individuals left, which really makes the work here unique, because you can't just go out and say, today we need to find 10 of these birds. Well, there might not even be 10 of them. So it really makes fieldwork very unique and interesting, and I have gotten to really love loggerhead shrikes in the last 2 years. Okay. I imagine from most of you being from the area, many of you will already be really familiar with what shrikes are. But for those of you who aren't, and in case you haven't seen one in person, shrikes are predatory songbirds. They're a little bit smaller than a robin. If you'd like to see a used-to-be live one, there's a taxidermy shrike at the back. They typically build their nests in dense, thorny shrubs. Here, it's usually hawthorn bushes. And they have broods of up to 7 young that are usually very well protected in these well-chosen bushes. Shrikes are definitely most famous for their feeding habits because they're fully predatory, but not only are they fully predatory, they also impale their prey, which there is one example of an impaled invertebrate on the left there, but I will be showing a few photos of impaled rodents later on in this presentation, but I'll always give you a content warning before that shows up, just in case anybody's squeamish with headless mice. Okay, so although they mainly eat invertebrates like grasshoppers and caterpillars and crickets, they can use their powerful raptor-like beak to take vertebrate prey like reptiles, amphibians, small mammals, and even other songbirds. I actually saw, last year I saw an eastern phoebe impaled on a hawthorn on Windmill Ranch, and in that almost same location, there was, this year, a clay-colored sparrow, which sounds really sad, but what that provides these birds with so well is a larder to feed their young, and that one bird can feed the young for a whole day. So it sounds sad, being a birder and loving sparrows more than anything, but it's really interesting to see. So they do quickly kill this prey with something called the tomial tooth on the end of their beak, which is a feature they share with falcons. With that, they're able to sever the spinal cord in one bite. If you look at this shrike at the back, or I guess really any picture, especially that one on the bottom right, you can see that sharp tip at the end of their beak. And so they don't impale live prey, they impale their prey after they're dead, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But they can kill prey up to 4 times their body size, which was just discovered last year. We used to think is only about 1.5 times their body weight, but we actually discovered that it can be up to 4 times, which is like, yes, exactly, thank you. I think it's crazy. Okay, so the reason that they impale their prey is because they're not like typical birds of prey that have strong talons. If you picture a bald eagle flying across the river, catching a fish and carrying it with their talons, that's what we picture when we picture birds of prey. But these birds have small songbird feet, so they can't do that. So what they have to do instead is carry their prey that they've just killed with their toenail tooth to something to impale it on, like a hawthorn thorn or barbed wire, and essentially it's there to hold the prey still while they can tear at it with their beak, since they can't really hold it with their feet. But because of this kind of gruesome behavior, they have been given the nickname the butcher bird, and some people have actually, not in recent history, but there's been records of people killing shrikes on their property, just shooting them because of this bad reputation that they have of being like killer birds. However, they really do only take prey that are very small, and obviously that also has contributed to their decline, even though it hasn't happened much at all in the past, recently. One further bit about shrikes. So in that top right picture, you can see the shrike regurgitating a pellet. And so that's all of the indigestible parts of their prey, the same way that raptors do, so they spit out that pellet, which is pretty cool. And you don't get to see it too often, but in captivity, it's fun to take those apart and see what prey they've actually eaten. So just a tiny note about loggerhead versus northern shrikes, since they do both occur in this area at different times of year. The way to tell them apart, the fastest way is that thick mask. So on the left we've got the loggerhead, on the right we've got the northern. The loggerhead shrike has a thicker black mask than the northern shrike does, and it also extends above their bill, so across both eyes, covering the entirety of both eyes, and a little bit over the bill as well, versus the northern shrike, that mask cuts across about the middle of the eye. Northerns also have some fine barring across their chests that loggerheads do not have when they're adults. And another good feature is that the northern shrike have a pale lower mandible, so like if you can see the loggerhead's black all the way across the bottom of the lower bill, versus the northern has a pale part just close to their chin. Northerns also have a contrasting white rump, which is noticeable in flight, versus the loggerheads usually have gray rumps, so they don't have. So if you see it from behind, that's one way to tell the difference. And then also the location. So northerns aren't ever really as far down south as we are now in the summer. They breed further north. Loggerheads are the only ones that breed here over the summer, and then they migrate down south later. From here on forward, when I mention shrikes, I always mean loggerhead shrikes, and most of the time I'm actually referring to only eastern loggerhead shrikes, which is a subspecies. But if I say shrike, I'm not ever talking about a northern shrike. There are a couple of other species that shrikes are easily confused with, some of which occur in Ontario, the others don't, like a Clark's nutcracker doesn't exist in Ontario. But these ones, usually it's just the white belly and the dark kind of upper part that people confuse them with easily. But they all lack that nice dark mask, so that's, of course, the thing that characterizes shrikes. So this is the range of the loggerhead shrike, the entire species, not just the subspecies that we're interested in Ontario. They do occur in multiple parts of Canada. There's that western side in the prairies, which is a different subspecies than we see here in Ontario. In Ontario, we only have that small blue section sort of between Lake Superior and Lake Ontario, and then extending up towards Ottawa. That is the tiny little section in which shrikes exist at all in Ontario. And then there are more shrikes in the southern, all through the states and down south, which I'll talk a little bit about later. I think it's actually on the next slide, so it'll happen in a second. But loggerhead shrike populations have been declining across the whole board since the 1940s, but the greatest declines have been seen in the east. And this is exactly what I was thinking I was going to talk about next, so great. So there are actually up to 12 subspecies of loggerhead shrikes in North America. Though they all look the same physically, if you analyze their DNA, they're actually very distinctly different in different geographical locations. So in the 1930s, there was a detailed morphological comparison conducted, and that came up with 11 subspecies, and that's the numbers that you see in black, in those black outline areas. You don't have to worry too much about this, because I'll get to the point in a second. But from this, the Ontario shrikes were part of the migrant subspecies, which is number 5 on this map. And that did extend partly into the northern central states. but recent genetic work has actually updated that, separating the ones that are in the States from the ones in Canada, because they actually turn out to be completely different genetically. So now the eastern and migratory subspecies, called the migrant subspecies, only occurs in Ontario, or at least only breeds in Ontario. And what that really means is that the Ontario shrikes are even more rare than we thought before. They live and breed only in Ontario, as I've said a few times, and there's a really small population. They're obligate migratory birds versus the ones in the south actually are residents. They stay down south and they don't migrate up north. So it's really important that these Ontario birds bring fresh genetics down into the southern birds, where they do somewhere between 5 and 15% of them actually integrate into the resident population, bringing new genetics into that area. So these birds in the Ontario area, the migrant subspecies, that's the ones that we at Wildlife Preservation Canada are concerned with, mostly because those are the ones that are in Ontario. So this subspecies was listed as endangered by COSEWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, in 1991, due to their significant declines in both their breeding population and the breeding range. These large-scale population declines in their range have been experienced since at least 1970, which is when most other grassland birds have also been in decline significantly since. The population in Canada now numbers fewer than 110 individuals. It's completely extirpated in the Maritimes, with no breeding pairs seen since 1972. But before that, they did breed through Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, and some parts of Newfoundland. But none have been seen, no breeding pairs have been seen since 1972. Fewer than 10 migrants individuals occur in Quebec, and most years don't have any breeding pairs, just single birds that can't seem to find a mate. The largest populations occur in Ontario, where there's believed to be fewer than 100 breeding loggerhead shrikes remaining in the wild, and those are mainly and mostly mixed together. Isolated into two core breeding areas, the Carden Alvar, which is why we're here today, and the Napanee Limestone Plain, which is out just west of Kingston. So we'll be hearing a lot about these two locations, Carden and Napanee. Okay, so some notes on the Ontario population of loggerhead shrikes. Between 1981 to 1985, during the first Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas, loggerhead shrikes were reported in 145 survey squares. Those squares are 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. And several of these squares were estimated to have between 2 and 10 pairs in them. So those are the red dots that you see on the map. Those are confirmed loggerhead shrike breeding locations between 1981 and 1985. Remember, there was 145 plots with them. In the second Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas, which was between 2001 and 2005, shrikes were only recorded in 38 survey squares. So you can see the difference. I've got the two maps next to each other. You can see the difference between these two atlases. All of the little black dots on the map show plot areas where loggerhead shrikes were found in the first atlas, but are no longer found in the second. It's a little small from afar, but the main point is those red areas, which I think I have, I'll circle them in a second. Those red areas are the only places left that consistently have loggerhead shrikes. So in 20 years, the breeding range of the shrikes dropped down to only 26% of where they were previously found. And so those two remaining areas, like we've said, are the Carden Alvar and the Napanee Limestone Plain. Up until recently, so in the 90s, there were actually 6 core areas identified by the Canadian Wildlife Service, which are shown in these circles, that had isolated populations, but those have actually pretty much blinked out, except for until this year. We'll talk a little bit more about the Grey Goose area a little later, where there were just somehow several shrikes seen this year, none of which were confirmed breeding, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. So Carden and Napanee are the only ones where there's still confirmed breeding every year. And when you look at shrike habitat, it's really clear why these spots have become the last strongholds in Ontario. A population viability analysis that was performed in 2009 indicated that extinction was almost certain within the next 100 years. The model predicted an estimated time to extinction of 43 years, and these declines were primarily related to this loss of suitable grassland habitat, both on the breeding grounds and on the wintering grounds. And now we've actually found out that also along the migratory route, that those habitats are also very important. So this is loggerhead shrike breeding habitat. This is what they would really like to go for, and of course this must look quite familiar to everybody here who has seen this before. This is in fact a picture of the Carden Alvar, so it makes sense why it would be familiar. But since they're a grassland species and a visual predator, especially you down there, because this is actually taking a turn of the edge. So when they do turn up, they're usually found in short grasslands with scattered perches where they can spot their prey from. And then they need to be able to get to the ground easily as well, so they can't have too much vegetation on the ground. This describes exactly the typical Alvar habitat, which are relatively open areas with some bare patches of ground and shallow soil above the bedrock that doesn't support a lot of plant growth. Big plants can't grow there because there's nowhere for their roots to go. Because of that shallow soil, it's also not very terribly productive for crops, but it is very good for cow pastures. And this works out really well. So I've got some cows on here. This works out really well for us because us meaning people that are concerned with loggerhead shrikes, because it keeps the vegetation nice and short, which is ideal for this species. However, this type of habitat is increasingly under threat, either through succession, which means shrub encroachment, when the cattle are removed and not keeping those plants short, or through other human developments. So here's a list of the top most limiting factors for loggerhead shrikes. Habitat loss has been identified as one of the key contributors. In Ontario, we've recently flagged solar farm development as an emerging threat, where large areas of open flat land, which is perfect for lots of sunlight, is also excellent shrike habitat, but it's unfortunately attractive to solar farm developers. This is especially an issue in Napanee, not as much in Carden, but historically, lots of historical shrike patches in Napanee are actually being taken over now by these solar farms, where they, to mitigate this issue, what they do is they actually buy up a different piece of land and do habitat stewardship on that, which has hit or miss results, because sometimes shrikes are happy to move to a new location and look at newly created grassland habitat, but other times they just can't find it quickly, and it won't be for at least 5 to 10 years that they actually end up breeding there. Habitat loss, though, is just one limiting factor. There are lots of other usual suspects as limiting factors for species at risk, which include predation, road-related mortality, pesticides, and an increase in extreme and erratic weather events from climate change. Shrikes have also been proven to be susceptible to West Nile virus in Ontario, so we now vaccinate all of the captive birds to keep them from getting it. The relative importance of each of these factors is still pretty unclear, but a 2015 viability analysis suggested that overwintering survival is probably has the biggest impact to our Ontario population. So unfortunately, the biggest hits to our birds in Ontario might be happening outside of our borders where we don't have any jurisdiction. And since the shrikes migrate to the mid-southeastern states, we actually have recently started to work together more with organizations down there. So what is WPC specifically doing to help? While many other organizations work on recovery measures that are focused on habitat protection and restoration pretty much solely, what WPC does and is specialized to do is that we work on hands-on intervention where populations are so small that they would go extinct without it. So remember that 4 to 3 year risk of extinction timeframe that I said before? That would almost certainly happen if it weren't for hands-on intervention. These hands-on activities can include captive breeding and release of birds, which is something we do with the shrikes. It can also mean head starting young, which means raising them in captivity until they reach a size that they're less susceptible to predators, and then also reintroducing animals into areas where they've previously disappeared from. So these make up some of our expanded conservation toolkit that goes beyond the indirect measures that are used by other organizations, which are also incredibly important, but this hands-on piece has been determined to be vital for shrike recovery. We strive to make our projects holistic, working with partners from all stakeholders to ensure that efforts are integrated in the spirit of the one plan approach. This approach starts with bringing together all of the parties that have any interest in species conservation, which is that top box, The interest can be in the recovery of the species itself or the management of the lands where the species are found. And then that second step is developing what the management strategies are actually going to be in collaboration with all of these responsible parties. And then the ultimate goal is to reach a viable population. And the one plan approach is now what's considered the global standard for species conservation, as it's clear that species conservation can't happen in a silo, but requires broad-scale collaboration. The Loggerhead Shrike Recovery Program, which is the one that I'm part of, is WPC's longest running program. In 2001, the Canadian Wildlife Service implemented a recovery program, which WPC took over in 2003. So the goal of this program was recently redefined at an international loggerhead shrike conservation planning workshop, which started in 2021, and we just did our final workshop in January of this year. The new vision statement it's quite wordy, but we're trying to encompass all of the different aspects that need to be looked at for shrikes. So we envision self-sustaining populations of loggerhead shrike that ensure the long-term viability of the migrant subspecies in suitable and restored habitat across the subspecies' historic range, including breeding, migration, and wintering habitats. Local communities and industries celebrate and understand the birds as an important component of thriving, diverse grassland ecosystems that span public and private lands. And so we tried to touch on all of the different aspects that impact shrikes so that we can, with this goal in mind, be as all-encompassing and hands-on as possible for this species. And of course, it's a really big goal to have a viable, self-sustaining population. And it takes a really multifaceted approach in a large range of people. And so WPC is only one piece of this, but here's what we specifically are doing. We have 4 major components, which is the captive breeding and release of the shrikes, wild population surveys and monitoring, habitat stewardship and restoration, and then collaboration with our range-wide partners. So the first piece is habitat stewardship, since it's no use in trying to recover a species if they have nowhere to live. If we don't maintain that, they obviously cannot survive. So as I've mentioned, cattle are really instrumental in keeping shrike habitat available in Ontario, and especially in Carden, where just about every single patch that we see shrikes on are also ranched by cattle ranchers. But the reality is that about half in all of Ontario are found on private land, and that private land is usually owned by cattle ranchers, or at least leased by cattle ranchers. So what that land looks like, looking at a closer look of what the actual specifics are and what aspects of this land need to be maintained, are these few components. So nest sites, perches, hunting areas, and impaling sites. Starting with nest sites, those are usually in those dense trees or shrubs that we talked about before. In Carden, usually hawthorn bushes. They're usually isolated somewhere that doesn't have many other bushes around, because shrikes like to have a perch where they can see all around their nest to make sure that there's no predators coming. If there's bushes too close together, then they don't have a clear view of what predators may be approaching. It also needs to have dense foliage that hides the nest away from anybody or anything that may be looking at them. So in Carden, these are hawthorn bushes, but in Napanee, cedar hawthorn rust has wiped out almost all of the hawthorn bushes, and so the birds there prefer to nest in red cedar. But wherever they nest, the adults tend to be highly protective of their nest tree and will alarm call enthusiastically if you approach. So hopefully this will play through my speaker. That's very quiet. Let's try again. Okay. So this is what their alarm call sounds like. If you hear this, back away. They are trying to tell you to get away from their nest. And you can, even not knowing that this is their alarm call, it's pretty obvious that this is a bird trying to tell you to get away. So they do have multiple other calls, but the other ones don't sound quite as angry as that. So here, yes, okay. So here's an example of a nest from 2023. So Neil, you'll have seen this picture before because I included it in my previous presentation. But this one's just such an interesting case to me, because like we said earlier that it's low dense shrubs that the shrikes are looking for, but sometimes they're not finding the right kinds of shrubs for them to nest in. There just aren't, for some reason they're picky about where exactly they are, and we haven't quite figured out all of the nuances to this yet. But in an area that had lots of other good shrubs that seemingly were taken over by orioles and grackles, shrikes ended up using this tree that was about 12 to 15 feet high. Usually it's only about 5 to 6 feet high, and I can quite easily see into them. But of course this one, I'm not a giant. So this one was really sparse and flimsy, and unfortunately, as it might be expected, this nest did not succeed. In the far right picture, you can see the nest cup partially destroyed. That's a view from below, so it should be nice and round, but it's actually lost about half the nest. And what happened with this one was either that the wind shook it in the high branches, or a predator found it because it's such a sparse tree. So all of these things made it more accessible to predators, and it was clearly a really poor choice in nest tree. So keeping as many good nest trees as possible on the habitat is actually quite important. So the second thing that they need is perches. The perches need to be of varying heights because they need these tall lookout perches, as you can see the dead trees in the back. And those are to look out for predators, to defend their territory against other shrikes, and also to attract mates. So male birds will often, not human men, they don't go up into the trees, but male birds will often sit at the very top of the trees and sing at the beginning of the season. So in early April, that's when you'll see the male birds singing up there. And those tall perches could also include hydropoles, larger deciduous trees, or even small windmills. Then they need some shorter perches, which are used for hunting. Those are usually less than 4 meters, can be fence posts, rocks, boulders, trees, all sorts of shorter perches. And these are important because the shrikes actually spot their prey from high up, as far as about 30 meters away, but then they come down to lower hunting perches to get closer to the prey to go in for the final kill. So then in between these perches, they do need those big wide hunting areas. So those areas are short grasses with exposed areas of soil and rock where they can easily spot their prey and not have to go down into the grasses. It's this dependence on short grasslands that makes pastures such a great habitat for shrike. And since grazing cattle are excellent at maintaining short vegetation, that's part of the reason why it's so important. But they also need this grassland to be native grasses, not just planted like Kentucky bluegrass or anything that you'd have on your lawn. They need these to be long-term native grasslands that they know exist because they'll have scoped out these areas as fledglings the year before. So we do need these long-lasting, long-term, low-succession native grasslands for shrikes. Luckily, something that Carden Alvar does have plenty of. So this is going to be, the next slide is going to be one with a content warning. It does have a headless, I believe this one is a mole. I think that's what's on the next slide. It's not very gruesome, but a little bit, and if there's any kids around, I usually like to tell them. But they do require these impaling sites as well. So we talked about why they use these impaling sites to rip their prey into smaller pieces, but it's actually very, very important during the nesting season because that's when they need to have this larder that they can go back to multiple times and get their food from to bring to their nestlings because they have to feed their babies every 2 to 3 minutes. They can't go out and hunt new prey constantly. It would take too much energy. So content warning. There we go. It's not that gruesome. It's actually not so bad. But a bit of blood. So shrikes are opportunistic in what they use for impaling sites. They can be thorns, like you see with the cricket on the bottom left, but they can also be barbed wire or crooks of branches like you see with this headless mammal. Impaling sites also allow shrikes to create a cache of food like we just talked about, but it also helps them to attract mates. So male birds will often put these food caches impaled all over their territory at the beginning of the season so that females that are coming and checking out the territory, they say, oh, this partner is really good at providing food. We're going to have a successful nest, and you've got this great pantry going for us. So clearly you're a good hunter, and yes, we can be partners. So when we're looking at developing a habitat stewardship project, which is the section we were talking about here, is we often have to do this with private landowners. And the message is, if they can help maintain shrike habitat by making sure that all 4 of these aspects are part of their land, then that's what's going to have the biggest impact on shrike populations. If they already have shrike on their property, then we just encourage them to keep doing what they're already doing because it's clearly working for the birds. But the chances that shrikes are attracted to an area increase significantly when shrike habitat makes up at least 15% of the landscape. So it can't just be one isolated good section within a forest. There needs to be good shrike habitat across about 15% of the landscape to make them attracted to it. So we then go and look and see how we could enhance those 4 aspects on any piece of property that a landowner has approached us about to do some stewardship. Some of the projects that we undertake are shown here. So we often help with installing or repairing cattle fencing, just to make sure we can keep the cattle on the property. Installation of watering system, which are also for the cattle. And then also removing shrubs and kind of reducing that encroachment. The easier projects are those first 2, the cattle fencing and the water systems. The shrub thinning is actually such a difficult project because it takes either a lot of equipment, which costs a lot of money, or a lot of hands, and also a lot of figuring out which trees may or may not be important to the shrikes. So we do go around and tag all of the trees that had nests in them in the past 10 years and make sure those ones stay up. Unfortunately, funding has been slightly lower in the past 2 years, and we haven't been able to take on any large habitat stewardship projects since 2022, but those are still, they're not stopped for good. It's just we need funding to go back up a little bit in the next coming years. These projects such as these are so important for this program because they're mutually beneficial to both parties. So if it's something that's good for the birds and good for the cattle, it's so much, we're doing a double duty here, like it's a win-win situation, and we're so much more capable of getting funding for that. However, since shrike are endangered, there are some considerations when we're doing habitat work. Their nest trees and the area within 400 meters of that tree are protected. So those are federally protected since it's a federally endangered bird. But this doesn't mean that work and changes can't happen in that area. Like cattle can graze through the area, and in fact we want that. But there are restrictions around larger land use changes, like building a solar farm, for example, or building a new structure within that area. And also removing that nest tree can't happen for the next 10 years. Unless you get specific approvals from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. But this is where things can get a little bit sticky for us because landowners, understandably, don't like being told what they can or can't do with their land. And so of the entire program, working on habitat protection is one of the most challenging aspects for sure, and has the greatest chance of conflict, especially with land that's owned by bigger industries. Okay, so changing gears a little bit here for a second. The shrike populations in Canada have been tracked since they were designated endangered in 1991, and that trajectory has been troubling over the past. There was a huge dip in 1997, and that low number is what catalyzed the creation of the captive population. So we took in about 50 birds just after 1997, and since then there's been some ups and downs, but the curve has flattened out significantly. In 2023, which is not on this graph, there were 40 confirmed wild loggerhead shrikes across eastern Canada. And this year that number has actually been way more encouraging. The final numbers haven't been solidified yet because I'm still living in the field until Friday, so we haven't actually gotten to do a lot of computer work yet. But so far we have confirmed there were 40 adult shrikes in pairs in just Carden and Napanee alone. And then a further 10 single birds in Napanee that were confirmed, and an estimated 10 more birds that were in places like the Bruce County, Manitoulin Island, Quebec, and Point Pelee. And there was even one seen in an urban park in Mississauga for about a week in May, which is very surprising. But that makes the total closer to about 60 wild adult shrikes across eastern Canada in 2024. So up from 40 to 60, which is huge. I mean, that's a giant jump, 50% increase. So the next of the 4 main conservation components is conservation breeding, or the hands-on part of WPC's work. The captive program has been a large part of this conservation action plan, but it's also a band-aid solution, so it's not something that we want to be doing forever. We do actually, the goal is to stop doing the conservation breeding as soon as the shrikes are able to keep their population up on their own. This captive population, though, has also been useful for our research. specifically identifying migratory routes and wintering grounds using tracking technology. I heard somebody talking about Motus towers before. I think we all did, actually. I think that was one of the upcoming presentations. So that's something that we're also part of. We started breeding those 50 birds that were taken into captivity around 1997, and we started releasing young already in 2001. So we were able to breed the birds so well in captivity that we had enough to replace any deaths that occurred early on in the program, and release birds already in 2001, which is really fast for a conservation program. That's like 3 to 4 years, versus most conservation restoration programs take 10 to 20 years to get off their feet. So we're really proud of that. Or at least the people that were doing it then were proud of that. I definitely was barely alive. Okay. The conservation bred birds are released in either our Carden or Napanee release sites. But we have 69 birds, adult birds in captivity currently across 6 partner breeding facilities. So that's where we get our captive release birds to release in the later in the summer and fall for Carden and Napanee. But these places that do the actual breeding are the Toronto Zoo, African Lion Safari, both of which are in Ontario, the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute in Virginia, the Nashville Zoo in Tennessee, the National Aviary in Pittsburgh, and most recently, we actually added one more breeding partner in Quebec called Parc Omega. These facilities house our breeding pairs from our captive population and we give them the opportunity to mate with a genetically compatible match each year. We try to be as hands-off as possible. We really just supply the necessities to the adult birds so that they can do their work in raising the young. We give them nesting material and lots of food, and we do daily observations from afar. But once the young they then get raised by their parents, but once they're independent, they're moved into our field release sites, and they're held there for about a week before we let them loose because they have a little bit more training to do. Before they're released, all the young are banded with a stainless steel band, which you can see in the picture there, but you can also take a look at in real size on the taxidermy trike at the back later. They are also given a unique combination of color bands so that we can tell them apart from afar when they hopefully return in the next years. We also monitor their health. We make sure that they're eating enough, and we weigh them. We check their body conditions. We give them vitamin supplements, as well as prophylactics to prevent disease before releasing them. And then when they are released, it's done using a soft release technique, which Tanya came and saw with the rest of the Couchiching staff a couple of weeks ago. And so instead of doing a hard release where we would basically open the doors and walk away and hope they leave, we actually do a soft release, which means we open the doors, we try not to scare them out of the cages, we give them all day to come out of their enclosures that they've been in. But if they don't come out during that time, we close the doors again and keep them safe overnight, and we try again until they're ready to leave. But while they're in those enclosures before release, they're actually trained to catch live prey, and we give them live mice over that course of time. And we also make sure that they're flying well, and that if we've given them a radio tag, that the radio tag is fitting properly and isn't obstructing their flight. So here's another one where, if you're squeamish, this is a headless mouse again. So we make sure that they're doing exactly this with their prey. We want to see that they've killed live mice and impaled them to make sure that these are the fittest possible birds to release, because we don't want to be releasing anything that might be not able to survive. Okay, the captive population has been instrumental in our research, like we were just talking about. And so this year there were 10 that were deployed with Motus tags, as you can see on the back of that bird. They've come such a long way. They're so much smaller than when I first started research 10 years ago. They're super light. They basically don't obstruct the birds at all. And we almost never even see the birds acting any differently after putting them on, which is amazing. But this year we deployed 10 of them, and these are tracked on the Motus Network, which is a collaborative research initiative spearheaded by Birds Canada to make large-scale radio telemetry more accessible to researchers. So with Motus, if a researcher joins the program, they can put a receiving station in an area, which we have, and that's what a Motus tower looks like there. And then they gain access to the entire network of stations all the way across the continent. So these yellow dots, this is from about 2 years ago, this map. I've probably got to update this by now. But the network keeps growing. They have a detection range of up to 20 kilometers around each of those yellow dots. But the limitation is that a radio tagged individual so then has to pass within that 20 kilometers for us to get a ping saying that they've been in that area. But luckily, in the majority of where shrikes go in that early part of their migration, the northern aspect, there are a lot of towers. The problem is there aren't that many towers when you get a little bit further south, and that's where we still don't have a complete picture of migratory routes for shrikes. Here's an example of some of the data that we collect. Most of the movements that we see are still in Ontario, where those towers are the densest. But usually we see the birds leaving Carden and Napanee and heading southwest around the Great Lakes through Detroit, but some of them actually do go through Buffalo, and some of them even cross straight across Lake Ontario. In 2018, we got our first US detections, which was really exciting. There was a bird that was released in Carden, and it got picked up in 3 towers in Pennsylvania in mid-September, which says that these birds are ready to move now. Like they're already migrating, they're already down south of the border, which we didn't know before that. We didn't know how soon they actually make it down out of Ontario. And then we had another bird doing that exact same route in 2019. So we were starting to kind of build that picture, but we still have a lot to go. Like I said, the further south parts of that migration is still very unclear. Oh, okay, so what we've accomplished. This is my favorite part to talk about because we have actually accomplished a lot. Since we started in 2001 with releasing our birds, we've released over 1,300 captive bred young back into the wild. And these birds have shown to be effective at slowing the declines of the wild population. We're not yet at an uptick, we aren't steadily increasing, but we've certainly leveled out the population, which is better than a decline. We've developed strong partnerships with our breeding facilities in Canada and the US. The return rates for our conservation bred birds are in line with those of wild birds, and even higher in some years. So some of them actually do return at higher rates because likely they were just fed better and kept away from predators while they were growing up. And then in recent field seasons, conservation bred birds have made up to about 1/3 of the birds found in Ontario in the wild. And this is my favorite bit of information, wild pairing with at least one captive origin bird, and sometimes even 2, have produced up to 1/2 of the fledglings observed in some years. So, in other words, that means up to half of all of the young that are produced in the wild have at least one parent that's from our captive breeding program, which is like incredible. This year in Carden, there were 7 successful breeding pairs, and 3 of those had one of the pairs was from our captive breeding program. So that's almost half of the nests, which is a really big deal. So it's clear that the captive breeding and release program is having a positive effect on keeping the birds on the landscape. So these are some of the birds that we released in Carden this year. So unfortunately, the problem in Carden is that we don't have access to a lot of the private lands. A lot of them are owned by aggregate companies that just don't want any barriers to them being able to develop. And so they don't have to let WPC onto the property to monitor the wild birds, and so then often they don't. There are some more socially conscious ones that do. We've actually made a really good new connection this year with Duffer and aggregates, which is great. But there are some that don't want any conservation work done on their property. And so even though there were 7 nests and 7 active pairs, we only had access to 4 of those properties that those birds were even on, so we couldn't even actually check how many net eggs they laid or how many nestlings were hatched, which is really unfortunate because we can't get a clear picture if we can't make proper counts. But that was sort of a tangent. We did this year release 44 conservation bred juvenile birds, which is a giant jump up from last year. Last year we only released 17. And so this year we released 44, 22 were at each release site, so 22 in Carden and 22 in Napanee. Oh, I should probably explain why that bird has blue on its chest. I just realized that's not a normal field marking for a shrike. So when the birds first come into captivity in the release enclosures, to try to have the least impact on them as possible, we mark them with permanent marker, which is also a very typical thing for all avian researchers to do. But it lasts only about 8 days, and it gives us a very easy way to spot which bird is which, so that we can make sure that they're eating and hunting appropriately while they're in captivity. Also then, as soon as they're released, when we monitor them for the next week or two, we're able to see how well these birds are still doing out in the wild, and if they're able to hunt wild prey. So it's really useful for us to be able to tell these birds apart from afar and not have to get too close to them. And it wears off in about 8 days, and it's non-toxic. So this bird got a blue chest, other ones get pink heads, red bellies, which is always scary because it looks like they've been sitting in blood. But yeah, it's a very good field technique to use for birds. Okay, switching gears now a little bit again, so away from the captive population and towards the wild population. So another aspect that WPC does is monitoring the wild population and their health each year. So each summer, our biologists, which the last 2 summers has been me, we go out into the field and we seek out occupied shrike territories, and we determine any band combinations for returning birds and then track their reproductive success. We try to band as many wild birds as possible so that we can keep track of them in the coming years. And so here's a few pictures of me out in the field. So in the Carden Alvar, we're here from end of April to mid-September. By we, I mean just myself and my dogs. And so some of you have actually likely maybe seen anywhere near Bluebird or Windmill or Cameron Ranches, because that's where I spend the majority of my days at the beginning of the season. So what I go out and do is basically every morning go to a different patch that's been previously said that has historical shrike activity, try to find those shrikes, and then if there are any on that property, we have to monitor them. I have to monitor them every 3 to 5 days to see if that partner has a bird. To see if that bird has a partner or a nest. And then we keep track of that nest and see how many eggs they lay, how many of those eggs hatch, and then how many of those hatchlings become fledglings. And through that, we get an idea of what the breeding effort is by the wild birds and what might be causing any breeding failures. So here is a quick video of a 2023 shrike nest in Carden Alvar at Windmill Ranch up Wiley Road. So this is one that is typically seen by the public because you can actually see this pair from the bird blind. But it shows a parent entering the nest and feeding its nestlings. And then when I zoom out, you can see the kind of hawthorn bush that is typically chosen for nesting. I did speed up this video, so if it looks like the bird is doing unnatural movements, it's because it's sped up. You can see it dipping right down to feed its fledgling or nestlings. They're still in the nest. And if you look really closely, you can actually see one of their beaks, that kind of yellowy patch on the left, with its gape showing there, asking for food. And this pair ended up with 5 successfully fledged offspring last year, which is amazing because that means that all 5 eggs hatched and fledged. These are some photos of that nest in the video, so you can see all 5 eggs, and then you can see all 5 nestlings, and then the picture on the right is one of the fledglings. So we do nest checks very carefully and quickly, and we're only the highest trained staff members are actually allowed to do them because shrikes are so endangered that you have to have a permit to be able to check their nests. The fledglings are then tracked for several weeks afterwards to get as accurate as possible of an idea of what the survivorship is of these birds. This here, with the 5 successful fledglings though, was actually the pair's 3rd attempt. Their first 2 nest attempts were failed. So we were looking at limiting factors before. When there are eggs that fail from abandoned or failed nests or predated nests, then we do collect those eggs so that we can look at if environmental contaminants had anything to do with it. Luckily, we haven't found any pesticides in shrike eggs at all yet, which is great. But nest predation has been flagged as one of, that's the pesticides on. Predation has also been flagged as one of the biggest growing issues in Ontario. So we've been setting time-lapse cameras at these nests to see what might be preying on these birds. But they take a picture every about 10 seconds. And so since they're on active pastures, most of the photos we get look like this. But we have had a few times where we've seen a northern harrier or a crow preying on nests. Okay, so as I was saying before, that pair had 2 failed attempts. This is the second nest attempt that same pair had last year. It was only about 30 meters away from their first attempt and only about 10 meters away from a 2022 nest tree. So it's really interesting when they pick such specific locations. But this nest failed because of an avian predation event. How you can tell that is because the nest, if you look at that picture after it was preyed upon, it's still in really good shape. Something small went in there and it didn't tear up the nest. It was able to go in and get those nestlings without causing too much of a disruption to the supporting structures. And we also found 3 broken eggs with no contents directly underneath the nest, which suggests that they were eaten on the spot. And there's a picture of a broken egg directly under the nest there. So another increasingly common cause of nest failures has been extreme weather events. These could be cold snaps that occur late in the season, extensive rainfall, which actually did cause issues in our captive population this year in Carden specifically, extreme heat and drought, or even possibly thick smoke from wildfires. So last year, we experienced lots of intense weather, with July being supposedly the hottest month on record in 120,000 years, and extremely unhealthy air quality into season June from the wildfire smoke across Canada. And these effects, or the effects of these weather events on shrikes, are so far unknown, but we do know that they do have some effect, which I'll be talking about in a minute. For example, the first nest of that pair, so the first of the 3 attempts, was definitely a failure that was caused by a weather event. So these are photos of the first nest attempt, but this nest failed after a prolonged sub-zero temperature event that happened in the middle of May, so much later than usually would occur, and 2 nights were under 0 degrees in a row. So most likely what happened is the female opted to abandon the eggs. Instead of working on warming them up, she kept herself warm and opted to have another nest attempt to save her warmth and energy, and abandoned these eggs. So we did collect them for future analysis. Interestingly though, that exact same tree was used by a pair this year for their first nest attempt, which also failed, unfortunately. So that tree is clearly not a good choice, but they did end up fledging 4 healthy young later this year. This is a video of those 4 healthy young while they were still in the nest. And we did watch them later after they had fledged. I think it's so cute when they hide in the nest during nest checks. They get really, of course they're scared of humans coming up close, but they do tend to duck down and hide, which is both sad and cute. This year though, Carden also had some crazy weather events. I don't know if anyone was here at the end of May when there was that huge hailstorm. I was out on Cameron Ranch about a 45-minute walk away from my car, thinking that I had enough time before that hailstorm started to get back to my car, and I didn't. I got fully clobbered by giant hail balls, which was horrible. Yeah, so that was nuts. I don't know if you can tell how big those balls were, but they were like just under tennis ball. Yeah, like bigger than golf ball, just under tennis ball size. I was carrying my backpack over my head, and yeah, it was not fun. But also surviving that was a little bit fun. My point is, with climate change comes an increase in unpredictable weather events such as these. There was a huge rainfall at the end of August this year in Carden, which contributed to the deaths of 2 shrikes, which are still under investigation as to what exactly caused that. But the day after the huge rainfall, we had 2 shrike deaths. And so obviously with climate change comes an increase in events like these. And we don't quite know what the full impact is in Ontario yet, but it's clear that there will be one. So what have we seen in recent years? So here's just a chart of up to last year, since we haven't updated this chart yet for this year. So last year there were 17 pairs of confirmed loggerhead shrike, with 11 of those pairs in Napanee the majority of them were in Napanee. There were only 5 in Carden last year. But 11 of the 17 pairs produced successful fledglings, but there were about 30 confirmed fledglings. So in Carden, there were 5 pairs, and they only had 7 confirmed fledglings. But this year, we've already talked about the fact that this year was much better for them. We confirmed about 60 wild adult shrikes. There were 7 successful pairs, which had at least 20 fledglings, which is almost triple that number of 7 from last year. So we're trying to figure out what made this year such a good year for shrikes relative to last year. But we had, almost triple the number of successful fledglings. So that's amazing. We hope that this trend continues. So the final piece of our Loggerhead Shrike Recovery Program is working with all of our partnering groups. So WPC is part and head, and often in certain years heads the Loggerhead Shrike Working Group, which extends from Canada down the States. These partnerships with our neighbors to the south are important because at this point, working in isolation for a migratory bird would make absolutely no sense. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, shrikes are in decline all the way across their range, but this image shows that all of those areas in yellow have had significant long-term declines in shrikes according to the Breeding Bird Survey. So the biggest issue for those birds that are breeding in Ontario is that the wintering grounds in the US are in decline as well. Like, they're very much being encroached upon through different agricultural practices and also housing developments. But now we have representatives in this working group from almost every eastern state, which is hopefully going to make a big difference across our next 10-year plan. So this 10-year plan that I just mentioned was created through a species conservation planning process for Loggerhead Shrike. It was headed by the Conservation Planning Specialist Group, which is a faction of the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So the IUCN is the one that designates a species as endangered or threatened or least concern. So that group is who headed this species conservation planning process. It used our one plan approach that we talked about before. We had cattle producers, NGOs, academics, aggregate companies, all sorts of people from the Ontario Beef Cattle Farmers Association. We had people from Miller Aggregates, basically trying to figure out what's the best and most realistic plan to attain our goal of having a viable population. And so we actually hosted a meeting in the Toronto Zoo at the end of January this year, and the same meeting was held in the Nashville Zoo concurrently at the same time, and we had interactions between both groups online, which was a lot of work, but we had 3 days fully dedicated to doing that, which is such a huge deal because especially during COVID, none of that could happen. None of this actual real-time talking could occur, which slowed down our progress by, the whole COVID term, so 3 years or 2 years at least. But we now have a solidified 10-year plan, which will be published by the end of the year for the public to see, which we're very excited about, and the payoff is going to definitely be worth it in the end. We've talked a lot about these different groups that we work with, so I won't go into too much detail, but on the local level, it's things like private landowners who we have good relationships with, and community members. Regional, this is the word I was looking for before, Neil, Carden Forum, that was the word, and the Napanee Plain Joint Initiative are groups that we're involved with on the regional level, as well as, of course, working with groups like the Nature Conservancy of Canada and Couchiching Conservancy and Birds Canada and any other groups that have an interest in working with shrikes. So then the national level, we have the Loggerhead Shrike Recovery Team, and then the Loggerhead Shrike Working Group, which includes all those other groups. I won't go into too much detail because we really did talk about that already. So then my last piece is, what can you all do to help? People always ask, how can we help this incredible bird, especially being people that are local and in this area? I have a few different ways that you can help. Being a good land steward. So if you own any land or have neighbors that own land that is good shrike habitat or has the potential to be, we have a really good resource online, and we also have physical copies of it that I can get to if you request one. But it's called the Loggerhead Shrike Landowner's Guide. It's right on our website, right on WPC's website, and it basically explains everything that you can do as a landowner to make your habitat the most attractive to shrikes. There's also a new program geared to eligible farms registered under the Canada-Ontario Environmental Farm Plan to encourage greater protection and conservation measures on such habitat. So this is available online. You can also volunteer. Volunteering with groups like Nature Conservancy Canada or Couchiching Conservancy, or sometimes WPC hosts our own volunteer efforts. Things like community cleanups, shrub thinning, and invasive species removal events are a very good way to get involved. You wouldn't think that community cleanups and cleaning up garbage would have a huge impact on shrikes, but especially in Napanee, shrikes like to pick up hay baling twine and use that in their nests. And every year for the past 3 years, a juvenile shrike has died by getting its foot entangled in the nest, like in that baling twine, as it's trying to escape the nest when it's fledging, and died there. So if there wasn't so much baling twine around, like that seems like such a clear way to prevent at least a few of the deaths of fledglings. But so that has a really big impact. Reporting sightings is also huge. If you think you saw a shrike, try to get a picture. But if you're a hobby birder or citizen science person at all using eBird or iNaturalist, reporting sightings is huge for us, because at the beginning of the season, that is actually where we and I get all of my information from. We look for any sightings on eBird first. We do encourage you not to put their exact location, just because we don't want people to get too close to these endangered birds. But when we start seeing sightings on eBird at the beginning of the spring, that's when we know it's time to send out our field biologists. We also do try to get in contact with anyone that has had a sighting, but if you can give us the exact location, you can email us at birds@wildlifepreservation.ca, and we will immediately go and follow up, because that's such a good way for us to get more eyes on the ground. But if you're really interested, okay, I'll do this one first and then I'll go back. If you're really interested in sighting shrikes, you can also join our Adopt a Site program, which has been engaging volunteers looking for shrikes all across their range in Ontario since 2012. So we take volunteers in all sorts of locations, so that's the Grey Bruce County, Carden, Napanee, Renfrew, so around Ottawa, and also Smiths Falls, and Manitoulin Island. So last year we had 35 citizen scientists who conducted 3 monthly surveys. This year we had over 50, so about 52 volunteers that we had this year. And so this program is really growing, and everyone seems to be really enjoying looking for shrikes, since they're sent to places where historically there have actually been shrikes spotted. The level of commitment that you have to do is basically one survey in April, one in May, and one in June. They usually take about 2 hours, and they can be done anywhere in the first half of each of those months. So it's very flexible. But you can contact me by email at the end of this. I'll give you my email at the end of the presentation if you'd like to join that program. One further thing is, if you are bird watching anywhere, do so safely. You need to be a good distance away from shrikes. They are really sensitive to human activity. So for our field biologists, our bare minimum distance is about 50 meters away. Yes, bare minimum. We want to be at least 50 meters away from the shrikes and looking with binoculars or scopes. And of course, keep to established paths and roadways. Don't bring your dogs into areas that are sensitive, or at least don't let them off leash. And don't use any call playbacks on your own, since those are really reserved only for official use, especially for species at risk. So we really try to get members of the public not to use those unless you've been given permission. Okay. So then, of course, I do have to end on this note, which is a really big way that you can help WPC or our partners organizations is to donate funds directly to our field monitoring efforts. Those pay for the food for the shrikes while they're in captivity, banding supplies, maintaining the enclosures, and also to expand our breeding partner facilities and allow for really important research projects to take place. Donations can be made directly through the WPC website.